Muy buenos días a todos. Es un
Good morning, everybody.
gusto tenerlos
It's
acá
a
en este
pleasure to have you here.
evento. Tenemos 120 participantes. Creo que ha sido una convocatoria muy buena. Muchas gracias a todos por estar acá en este webinar que hemos organizado junto con la Asociación Mundial de GLP. Ahora en un momento le voy a dar la palabra a Nikos Sidas, quien es el director, gerente técnico de la Asociación Mundial, con quien hemos organizado este webinar. El tema que nos trae hoy es un tema del mayor interés, creo que para todos en la industria y para los tomadores de decisión, en la medida en que estamos hablando de un GLP renovable, de un GLP de origen biológico, que es muy novedoso en el país como GLP, pero que ya en el mundo está entrando, está en unas fases germinales y vamos precisamente a hablar de ese nuevo combustible renovable en el mundo. Creo que el país tiene un reto muy importante en materia de su canasta energética, aun cuando tenemos una buena porción de ella renovable porque es hídrica. Por supuesto, tenemos que hacer la transición hacia una economía totalmente descarbonizada. Ese es el compromiso que tenemos, no solamente como país, sino frente a la comunidad de naciones. Tenemos que pasar hacia energías renovables y tenemos el GLP renovable. Entonces, vamos en este seminario a ver qué es el GLP, el BioGLP, cómo se produce, cómo está la situación de los mercados, dónde ha crecido. Vamos a ver ejemplos internacionales. Cuando hablamos de ejemplos en materia de energías renovables, pues nada mejor que ver el ejemplo de California, ver el ejemplo de Europa. Y tenemos unos conferencistas muy distinguidos. Ahora Nikos va a presentarlos. Mientras tanto, quería explicarles que en la parte, vamos a conducir el webinar en inglés. En la parte de la pantalla de abajo a mano derecha, ustedes encontrarán un botón que tiene la traducción. Cuando quieran oír en español, pues que creo que va a ser la mayoría, pues ponen en el botón español. Nuestros asistentes que quieran oírlo en inglés, pues tienen que poner el botón en inglés. Yo creo que esta va a ser la única parte en que vamos a hablar en castellano, así que tienen que tienen que mantenerse en este canal, porque de ahora en adelante vamos a hablar todo en inglés. Entonces, sin más introducciones, le voy a dar el paso a Nikos para que él presente a nuestros distinguidos conferencistas y panelistas e iniciar nuestro webinar. Muchas gracias a todos de nuevo por su asistencia. Nikos.
Yes, many thanks, Alejandro, and many thanks to Gasnova, the Colombian LPG Association, for inviting us today to this webinar. If we can put the first slide up, please. Now the second slide after this one that I'm seeing now on my screen. We will start. Yes, this one. Thank you. I will start first by saying that BioLPG, renewable LPG, it is actually what is going to bring us into the future, the LPG industry into the future. So it deserves indeed the uppermost attention from all of us. So before I start, a very short introduction about myself. I'm Nikos Xidas, and I'm the technical director of the World LPG Association, the WLPGA. And having passed most of my career with Shell, I am now in the association taking care of this very important role of discovering the pathways of renewable LPG, of BioLPG. You know that we have today a great panel of experts amongst us to go through this webinar. And I would start, of course, with Alejandro Martinez, who has very kindly put the invitation to us, and president of the Colombian Association of Gas Nova, to continue with Joy Alafia. Joy, she's the president and CEO of the US Californian LPG Propane Association. We will have with us also Eva Bramiuk-Lette, who is the general manager of the European LPG Association, which is called Liquid Gas Europe. We have Eric Johnson of Atlantic Consulting, who is the principal consultant for us, for the association, for this work, and our scientific advisor. So you will see that the most interesting and detailed parts on BioLPG, renewable LPG, you will hear them from Eric, and then it will be myself, and this makes us the panel of 5 that you see up on your screen. In the next slide, you will see that we have an overview of the agenda. So we'll start with some words about the activities of WLPGA. Then we will pass to Eric, who will tell us about the details specific of BioLPG. We will hear about the California journey for renewable propane from Joy. Then from Eva, we will have the European picture. We will have a panel discussion among all of us, and then we have the summary and the conclusions that will follow. So a few words now you will see starting from the next slide. You will hear a few words about WLPGA and the activities that we have in renewable LPG. And as the next slide shows you, we are an association which covers really a very, very wide, very bright spectrum of activities. We cover everything from production to shipping and trading, to storage, to distribution and retail, going to services, the entire supply chain of LPG, of propane. We promote the use of LPG as safe, clean, healthy fuel. We do a lot of work on market development and a lot of work on industry good practices to advise our members, innovation, outreach, advocacy. We also have our World LPG Forums, as you saw, as the next one is coming in Dubai. And we have more than 300 members in the association, which come from more than 125 countries. And you will see in the next slide that our activities are grouped into 2 big parts: in advocacy, business improvement, and also innovation and growth. And this is where this subject we are discussing comes in the innovation and growth. And the next slide, it will show you that actually the most important maybe goal this year, it is to demonstrate that 50% of the 2050 non-chemical demand in the LPG industry can in fact be met by renewable LPG, by BioLPG. This is a huge goal. It is a very important goal for us, and this is where we are focusing at the moment. And you will see that in the next slide that we're not talking only about the renewable LPG. We are talking also about other molecules which may fit in our industry besides the renewable LPG. For example, a renewable DME, or you will hear about hydrogen, or a renewable ammonia. So all these things you will see, and in the next slide, you will understand that we manage this through a steering committee of 6 members plus 2 from the WLPG and the UGA International. It's a big steering committee which gives us the direction of where to go. And on the next slide, you will see that we have 45 members in our working group where we deal and we discuss all these subjects. And we have a small team of 8 members where we meet, in fact, every week to discuss the details of our work. We have done a lot of work until now, really a lot of work, and you will see on the next slide what this kind of work is. We have developed a lot of reports, a lot of studies, which came from our members, and a big part of it, it is done together with Eric, who is with us, acting as our consultant. We have produced a report on the BioLPG, the renewable future, where we display all the technologies available and what the future looks like, what are the volumes current and the potential volumes to come. We have a specific report which talks about production of renewable LPG from cellulose and from waste. Another very recent one was the alcohol to jet fuel, because this is also another path of producing renewable LPG. You will hear from Eva afterwards about the BioLPG, the renewable pathway in Europe to 2050. Very, very exciting, exciting outcome and report on this. And we completed very recently another study which talks about the economics of production of renewable LPG, and actually why a producer produces or does not produce renewable LPG. When I say producer, the refiners today, the biorefiners, mostly from the HVO process. On the next slide, you will see what we have in our pipeline, what is coming now, what we are working, in fact, at this moment. So we are working on the world renewable pathway towards 2050, similar to what we did for Europe, but for the world. And this is what will be very, very important for you. We are planning to complete this near the end of the year. We started working on renewable DME. It's what I mentioned before, that we are looking at also outside the renewable LPG. So renewable DME is something that we are working on. There are a lot of similarities between DME and LPG, and it can fit quite well also in our industry in some proportions that maybe up to 20% in our product, but this is important work we are doing now. And the last working group we have deals with the renewable LPG products. It is related to what I said before, that in our industry, we will not have renewable LPG in the future. We may have renewable DME, we may have hydrogen, we may have ammonia, and all these products need to come together with the definitions. We know that today the definitions of LPG are mostly based on the fossil LPG, the one would come from oil, from refining, from gas exploration, and so we need to change these ones to reflect the renewable element of the product. So I will finish with the next slide to give you an idea of what we are working on now with the renewable DME. So this is a working group that we have created, and we work together with the International Energy Agency and with the National Renewable Energy Agency, with IRENA. So it's very important that we work together with these associations, these agencies. And of course, we follow and we track all the bio conferences and events that they take place. So this is a very short summary of who we are and what we are doing. But now I would like to go to the very important part, which we will hear from Eric on the details of renewable LPG. On the next slide, you will see the what and the why and the who and the where. So Eric will take us very nicely through this very interesting session, and I would like to pass the floor to Eric now. So Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nikos, and thank you, Alejandro. Good morning to all. Buenos dias. My aim is to give an introduction to renewable LPG. And as the next slide shows, I will address this in 5 parts. First, what is renewable LPG? Secondly, why is renewable LPG needed or wanted? Thirdly, who and where and what's going on up to now in this area. Fourthly, a bit about pathways to the future. And fifthly, talking about incentives and disincentives, in fact. At the end of my talk, which is about 25 minutes or so, I'm very happy to take questions. And also you will see my contact details at the end of the presentation. I'm very happy for you to contact me further after this seminar is over. Happy to help out. So going to that first question on the next slide, what is renewable LPG? Well, as we go to the next slide, we see the universe of energy, so to speak. Most people divide energy into two broad types. There are renewables, and then there are what we could call depletables. Renewables never run out. There's always more energy available. Depletables, by contrast, can be depleted. We can exhaust the supply. Then of renewables, there are two main types of those. There's bio, which come from plants, biomass, or animal fats. And then there is inorganic renewables, and that would be hydro, wind, solar, geothermal mainly. And then depletables are, of course, are fossil fuels and nuclear energy. Now, one final point here is that in common speech, many people use the words renewable and bio interchangeably. They mean the same thing to many people, even though strictly speaking, they are not the same thing. So what is renewable LPG? Well, as we can see on the next slide, today it is biopropane. It is the same molecule as fossil propane, and that's true also for biobutane. So it's the same molecule, but it comes from a different feedstock. Fossil LPG comes from oil and gas. Biopropane, bio-LPG by contrast, comes from animal fats, it comes from vegetable oils, from biomass, from wastes, from residues, from renewable sources. Now, there are about 8 different production pathways that we've identified that lead to RLPG, and 2 of those are commercial. I'll get into more detail on that later. The main path, though, that we have today is HVO, hydrogenated vegetable oil. And biopropane, most of the biopropane today is a co-product of renewable diesel made by this HVO process. So that you have HVO, you get HVO biodiesel, and you get HVO biopropane. That is the main source of our LPG today. Next slide, please. Renewable LPG's main feature is its low carbon footprint, its low carbon intensity. The RLPG on the market today is usually about 50 to 80% lower in footprint than fossil LPG. Next slide, please. To show that in more detail, you'll see here the carbon intensity of HVO biopropane. As I said, this is the RLPG today that is today in the market. This can range from about 5 to 102 grams of CO2 per megajoule of fuel at a lower heating value. Now, fossil LPG, by contrast, is around 75 grams. Now, I know 5 to 102, that's a wide range, but most of the stuff, most of the biopropane that's on the market today is somewhere between 5 and 40 grams CO2 per megajoule. The variation is due to differences in feedstocks and in the way that these footprints are calculated. Now, on the other characteristics that you see here on the slide, things like heating value and density and so on, biopropane and fossil LPG are really pretty similar or even identical. So as we look at the next slide, we see that the carbon intensities, the carbon footprints of fuels, these vary hugely. The first 2 you've already seen in the previous slide, those are fossil LPG and HVO biopropane, but here are some other fuels for comparison. Now you'll notice that electricity's footprint has the greatest variation. Now where I live and work, which is in Switzerland, the electricity footprint is about 2 grams of CO2 per megajoule, 2 grams. We use here a lot of hydropower and a lot of nuclear power. Now in places like China and India, where they use a lot of coal, electricity footprints can be as high as 300. They're all over the place. And footprints can even be negative. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see renewable DME, which can have a negative footprint of 278 grams. And it's negative because this DME can be made from cow manure, and so it eliminates methane emissions from that manure. I know that might sound kind of crazy, but you can get these negative footprints. Now, this next slide, I would like to actually skip it. I've left it in because some people might want to see that detail, but in some of the discussions we've had, I think this is probably a little bit too detailed for what we're doing today. So let me go into the next one, which tackles a major question for you as LPG players, and that's the business case. Well, here's a summary that you can tell your boss, or maybe you are the boss, either way. The global capacity of renewable LPG today, that's HVO biopropane, is about 500,000 tons a year. Now, just by contrast, fossil LPG is around 320 million tons. So it's relatively small, but it's not nothing. Growth from 2018 to 2025 has been about is expected to be about 30% per year. Fantastic growth rate, a lot of growth going on. The main market so far is in automobiles. Heating and cooking, they need some development, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. As far as costs and margins, well, they're similar to other biofuels, basically, and that is to say it requires incentives. Most biofuels, most renewable fuels do not work without government incentives. Next, most production of HVO biopropane and of RLPG in general is as a byproduct. It is not the intended product usually of the process. And then finally, there are definitely some regulatory challenges around RLPG and around renewable fuels in general. For one thing, when it comes to LPG or RLPG, there tends to be an ignorance of regulators and regulations. I mean, a lot of them don't even know what LPG is, much less do they know what renewable LPG is. Secondly, there's an issue of the so-called food for fuel debate that goes around use of crop feedstocks like plant oils and sugarcane and corn and all those sorts of things, and turning them into fuels, which to my mind is actually overstated, but it's a serious question and people raise it a lot. And then finally, there can be quite a lot of debate about what is the real carbon footprint of any given fuel. These can be calculated in different ways, and people come up with different answers, and they can argue about it quite a lot. So basically, there's an interesting business case here. So let's look to the next slide and move forward to why renewable LPG. Now, if we go to the next slide and we look at the entire world, about 2/3 of the world in economic terms is headed towards carbon neutrality. That's about 1/3 of the planet in terms of population. Either way, a large part of the globe is aiming for carbon neutrality. This is not just about renewables, it is also about energy efficiency. But whatever, renewables are big and they're getting bigger. In the United States, the clear leader is the state of California, which has about 40 million people in it. That's just a bit smaller than Colombia. It's about as large as Spain or Poland or Canada. And Joy will be talking about California. California is very much as I say, very much the leader in this in the US. And they aim to be carbon neutral by 2045. The rest of the US is decarbonizing as well. With the new president, Joe Biden, he's pushing this. China aims to be carbon neutral by 2060, Japan by 2050, and Colombia aims to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, the next slide basically shows the same thing. It's just sliced a bit differently. Basically, as I say, the majority of the world is decarbonizing or at least pledging to decarbonize. So if we go to the next slide, as you can imagine, decarbonizing calls for some huge changes in how the world works and how we live. And that's to say, if we really aim to go to zero carbon or carbon neutral. What I'm showing here is a timeline from a recent study of the International Energy Agency. And they have a scenario where the world becomes carbon neutral by 2050. It's called the net zero scenario. For net zero to happen, some of the changes are, by 2025, there will be no new sales of fossil fuel boilers. By 2030, 60% of cars sold would be electric. By 2035, none of the cars sold would have internal combustion engines. And by 2050, 50% of heating would come from heat pumps, 85% of buildings would be zero carbon, and so on. Basically, this is huge. To the next slide, I have a final point on the question of why renewables. I've seen so many companies who are confused about obligations and offsets, so I'll mention it here. Decarbonization is mainly about obligations, and I've listed 3 of the main ones here that are in effect. There's the LCFS, which is in California. There is the Renewable Energy Directive in the EU, and then there's the RIN system, which is the federal system in the US. Basically, the energy industry is obligated to reduce carbon. In time, you must do it. It's the law, and that's where you should focus. Now, at the same time, you look on the right-hand side, many companies trade in offsets or carbon credits. For instance, you can offset emissions of an airplane flight by planting trees, and people sell and buy these kind of offsets. And this is all fine, there's nothing wrong with it, but it does not meet your obligation as energy suppliers. So I urge you, focus on the obligation. That's really what you must do. Okay, let's go to the next slide in the next topic. Who's going renewable and where and what's going on? Now, as you probably know, the electricity sector moved first and moved farthest when it came to decarbonization. And this chart shows the additions of renewable power, and this is global, by the way, from 2014 to 2020. Now you'll see that photovoltaic has increased the most, but basically the point is that there's been a lot of renewable power added, and they brought their footprint down in a major kind of way. Now, it used to be thought that renewables would be a brand new industry with completely new companies, but that is not turning out to be the case. As the next slide will show you, it's a lot of well-known names in the oil and gas industry that are decarbonizing. All of these companies have committed to cutting carbon, including Ecopetrol. Even Exxon and Chevron, which were the slowest to join the club, they've started to join. So your entire industry is looking to decarbonize. Now, as we look at the next slide, here or there in Colombia, about half of your LPG production comes from refineries. What we are seeing in Europe and North America is that refineries are going renewable. The idea is that they switch from refining crude oil or petroleum to refining plant oils or animal fats or waste oils. Now, some people call these things biorefineries, whatever. In some cases, they convert completely to bio. There's several cases that, they just become a biorefinery in totality. And in other cases, they just partially bring in bio feedstocks. But anyways, this has started in a big way. The refining industry, at least in Europe and in the US, is very much headed towards becoming renewable or bio. So if we look in the next slide, just to show what they are actually doing with regards to LPG, you see this big molecule here on the slide. Well, that big molecule is an animal fat or a vegetable oil. And it's actually the same as the fat in our bodies. Actually, fat looks pretty much the same wherever it is. And what refiners do is they react this fat or this oil with hydrogen. It's called the HVO process. And what comes out is HVO biodiesel. People also call it renewable diesel. That's the yellow part there on the right. That goes off and becomes biodiesel. The brown part on the left looks a lot like propane, doesn't it? Well, it is. It converts to biopropane, HVO biopropane. As I already said, that biopropane is a byproduct. It's about 6% by weight of the total output of the plant. Renewable diesel, the stuff on the right, the yellow stuff, that is the target product. RLPG is a byproduct. Now, the next slide shows there's a lot of this byproduct production going on. This shows the capacity in the Americas. You'll see some capacity in Brazil. And by the way, there's some more planned. Nothing so far in Colombia. And by the way, Joy Alafia will be showing some similar figures in her presentation when she talks about California and the US. Now, in the next slide, you will see some capacities in Asia and Europe. At this point, the largest producer is a company called Neste Oy. That is the state-owned oil company in Finland. Neste has production in Rotterdam, in Finland, and in Singapore. Now, as the next slide asks, what about Colombia? Well, it's a good question. As this slide shows, Colombia might have a lot of potential. You have a good-sized market, around 720,000 tons. You have significant imports that are subsidized. So the government might want to switch that subsidy to domestic production, right? Could be. You have a very good network of established distributors, many of which are sitting in the audience today. On the supply side, you have regulation and you have subsidies. You have a state-owned oil company. So the industry and the government already cooperate. Well, at least they're supposed to. And you have significant biofuels production already. You have a lot of biodiesel and ethanol production. You have a lot of palm oil, and you have a lot of sugarcane. Oh, and your government and Ecopetrol have committed to carbon neutral. So I think you have a fantastic set of circumstances to get on with renewable LPG there in Colombia. Now, if you look at the next slide, I have shown some research and development areas, some R&D areas that you might want to explore. But I've just put these up for thinking because, to be dead honest, where I think you should focus is on the previous slide. You really have an interesting supply and demand situation, which could be a fantastic opportunity. So on to the next topic, pathways to the future. Now, in this part, I will say in advance, strap on your seatbelts because I'm going to fly through some of this stuff. But don't worry about the chemistry. It's not that important right now, but it will be. You'll need to know about it in time. So I've included some detail that you can read later, but we're going to buzz through some of this now. Now, as this slide shows, there are many pathways to renewable LPG, and it can get really complicated. I mean, in some ways, you can get from anything to anything when you're doing chemistry. Critically, in nearly all the pathways, as I've said before, RLPG is a byproduct. So this is an issue. It means that LPG will not drive most renewables projects. They'll be driven by diesel or gasoline or jet fuel, you know, the renewable versions of those. So most likely you will have to work with those people. Now, this next slide shows that same flow chart there in detail. As I say, there are a lot of ways to LPG, to renewable LPG. Fortunately, there's an easier way to look at this. In our work at the WLPGA, we have identified 8 main pathways to RLPG, which are in the next slide. If we could, yes, thank you. Now, these are still mostly byproducts, but at least the pathways are a lot easier to understand. The 2 pathways at the top are already commercial. Mainly, as I said, the main one is HVO biopropane, but there is a small amount of production of biopropane and biobutane from ethanol that has recently gone commercial. Now, there are 6 other pathways that are possible producers of RLPG. For instance, biogas can be converted to propane or butane. Cellulosics or waste can be gasified, and one of the products can be LPG. Bio-oils, and by bio-oils, I mean, you know, soy oil, palm oil, rape oil, all that kind of stuff. That can be dehydrated in a cat cracker at a refinery, and one of the products is LPG. Then there is so-called power to X. People use renewable electricity to react water and carbon dioxide into hydrocarbons. Now, I know this sounds kind of crazy, but you know, it can actually be done. And there is actually a plant planned in the south of South America, in the deep south of Chile, to do just this. And then finally, glycerin and sugars can be converted to LPG as well. So there's a lot of possibilities out there. And what we've done in the WLPGA working group that Nikos introduced is we've explored these pathways in great detail. Now, what I'd like to do is show you one slide of detail on one pathway, and then I'm going to skip over the others, but feel free to read through these things and look at the reports we've done. So if we go to this next slide, we're looking at the oligomerization of olefins. I know that's a mouthful of a word or of a phrase. A simpler way to describe that is so-called alcohol to jet. And the process is shown in basic terms on the right-hand side. Alcohol, that's ethanol, is converted to ethylene, and this is then oligomerized to butane. That's the C4H10. It can also be oligomerized to propane, and most importantly, to jet fuel. That's why it's called alcohol to jet. And this is where the commercial interest is focused. Now, there's lots of ethanol around. There's actually a glut of ethanol these days. The yields of the process are not bad. A number of companies are looking at this: Gibo, Lanzatech, Vertimas, Swedish Biofuels. And in fact, a company called EcoBenz, which is in Poland, is making RLPG using this process. They make about 6,000 tons a year. They started earlier in 2021. Now, there's a lot of interest in this alcohol to jet because decarbonizing aviation is difficult. And this is one of the few ways to do it. EcoBenz has shown that it can be done for RLPG. Hey, you could do it with Colombian ethanol. So let's skip over all these other pathways to slide 52, I believe it is. The heading is What's Happening in 2021. There we go. There's a lot going on. I don't think that COVID has slowed this thing down. In HVO, there's a lot of additions of capacity coming on. I mentioned gasification. It is finally going commercial. Not making LPG yet, but it's finally going commercial. Two of the world's largest LPG players, SHV and UGI, have announced plans to commercialize gasification. Pyrolysis, I mentioned cat crackers. The trials in this are continuing. Oligomerization, there's progress that's going on there. And finally, there's RDME, renewable DME. A company called Oberon Fuels has started production, and other projects are in the works. So where are you in South America and Colombia? Well, as I mentioned, there is some HVO production in Brazil, but there could be production in Colombia. Now, going to the next slide. How do you make this happen? Well, you'll have to deal with incentives and disincentives. These are absolutely critical in all renewable fuels, by the way. Governments are using many tools to drive decarbonization. The main ones, as you see in the left-hand column, are obligations, taxes, and standards. Now, to the right, you will see the regions where these already apply. And those are, by the way, all those abbreviations, those are abbreviations for various countries, you know, like CZ is Czech Republic, D is Germany, S is Sweden, and that kind of thing. So as I said earlier, you're going to want to focus on obligations because that's what's going to drive production of RLPG. Now, in heating and cooking, you will also want to pay attention to standards. What we're seeing in Europe already is that building standards are being passed that ban fossil fuels. So you need to be careful about all this stuff, really. As we go to the next slide, you will see that existing obligations, existing regulations can be very unfair. A recent study that Nikos mentioned that we did for WLPGA, it showed that in 4 regions, California, Germany, the rest of the USA, and the United Kingdom, there are obligations that steer renewable LPG away from heating and cooking. The big incentives today are for renewables in transport. And this chart shows that the price that non-transport sectors pay to buy away renewable LPG from transport, well, the sectors are shown along the bottom. You'll see that for RLPG and heating, customers must pay prices several times that of fossil LPG. In Germany, they have to pay 3 times the price of fossil LPG to get renewable LPG into heating and cooking. That's a big, big, big premium. So obviously you want to avoid this situation in Colombia. As the next slide points out, you also want to avoid the situation that half of renewable LPG produced today is not sold as a substitute for fossil LPG. It is sold as feedstock to make green hydrogen. This is a problem. I mean, this is a problem for your industry. So to the next slide, what does this mean? The main thing I can tell you is that you need to talk to the regulators to make this RLPG thing happen. And I mean talk, which also means listen. I would not start by saying, give us this, give us that. I would say, how do you plan to decarbonize? And how can we help you do that? So what I'm trying to say is I would not really start with advocacy as such. I would start with conversation. Talk to them, figure out what they're looking at, look at what the regulations are, get into that discussion. I think in Colombia, they will be pretty conversant with what's going on, at least in general, because you do have a big biofuel sector already. But the topic is very complicated. It might require many conversations and a lot of study to get on top of it. And so now to my final slide. I would advise you to talk to regulators and also talk to Ecopetrol, which is kind of like talking to the government anyway. You need to become part of the system, part of the solution, and not be part of the problem. And there's a final thought here is, what about biojet? You probably know that aviation, airlines and airplanes are trying to commercialize bioaviation fuel, renewable jet fuel, which I already mentioned. Well, you can make biojet with the HVO process, and you can make it with alcohol. And both of these things make RLPG as a byproduct. And you have those resources there in Colombia. Why not encourage Ecopetrol to pursue this? Now, I suggest this partly because it's a conversation starter with your government and your main supplier. But the most important thing is that you start that conversation and start it as soon as possible. With that, I thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to answer questions now. And like I say, you have my email and phone number and so on. If you come up with questions along the way, just fire something off. I'm very happy to speak to you about it. And I thank you for your time.
Eric, that was a great presentation as always, and really an excellent insight on the world of renewable LPG, the bio-LPG. Eric has been with us since the beginning of our journey towards the pathways and making our industry and our products renewable, and a very, very, really close advisor to both our associations, the World LPG and also Liquid Gas Europe, the European one, and also to specific members in our industry. So thank you very much again, Eric. Before I I ask if there are any questions, just a reminder to everyone that you can put your questions through the chat box, and we'll try to answer them during the session or at the end when we have the panel part, or separately afterwards after the webinar. So please don't hesitate. Feel free to put any questions you have through the chat box. Are there any questions, Alejandro, in the chat box? I'm sorry, I cannot go through the Spanish questions maybe there, but do we have any questions on the chat box for Eric?
There is one, and it says, we know that today there is only one production process of bio-LPG commercialized in Europe, that is our LPG as co-product of HVO diesel. Do you think this production route is mandatory for initial production of bio-LPG in Latin America, or that we can start by focusing on other production processes?
That's a very good question. But I think the best place to start in Colombia, at least, is with HVO, because you have these big resources of palm oil. You have an established refiner who Ecopetrol is an advanced refiner, and actually making HVO, either the renewable diesel or the biojet or the HVO biopropane, it's not that complicated. It's basically a modified hydrotreater, which many refiners already have, and I believe actually Ecopetrol has a hydrotreater at one of its refineries. And so with not too huge an investment, we're talking single-digit millions, you can take an existing hydrotreater, convert it, and boom, you just feed in vegetable oil and you start getting those products out. And that would be my first choice. To the point of other routes, as I mentioned, I think this alcohol to jet thing, there is some small amount of production from this company called EcoBenz in Poland. And there's no reason to think that the Colombian ethanol could not do the same thing. You could, you know, I mean, it's the same process basically. And you have all this ethanol there. There's oversupply of ethanol anyway. I think you have interesting possibilities, but I would start with HVO. And actually, the argument I think I would use to your government is I think your imports of LPG are about 100,000 tons a year, something like that. And if I understand it correctly, there's a fair subsidy that is placed on that by the government. Well, I'd say to them, hey, why don't you take that money and subsidize domestic production of biofuels? And then you're hitting both targets at once. You know, you're saving your own money, you're putting it into your own country, and you're helping yourself get down to to renewables targets and carbon neutral by 2050.
Okay.
Thank you, Alejandro. I see the questions from the chat in English. Yes, I think I can also read them myself. And Eric, there is another question for you. How do you see the potential of biogas? Actually, a very good question. The potential of biogas to produce bio-LPG. Does this digestion cost hinder biogas utilization to bio-LPG, BioGLP?
Yeah, that's a good question. The thing about, well, let me start with saying about biogas. There is the production of biogas is booming. You know, I forget what the precise growth rates are, but they're huge. And you know, people go in and they go to sewage treatment plants, they go to farms, they go to municipal wastewater treatment plants and that sort of thing, and they can convert all this sludge and all this bio crud, so to speak, into biogas. Taking it further though is pretty tricky technically. The problem is that biogas it's about 50% methane and it's about 50% CO2, and then there's also some crud in it. You know, there's sulfur and there's some phosphates and weird things like that. And the problem is, if you want to convert it further, you pretty much have to get rid of the CO2 and especially of all that crud. And people have not figured out yet how to do that economically. But at the same time, a number of people are working on it, and particularly in cooperation with WLPGA, there's a company called Plasmarica that is trying to develop a process for it. They seem to be making great progress. You know, they're cracking along, but obviously that needs to happen pretty quickly to really make a dent in things. But that's there's a lot of technical challenges, but this could be very promising.
Yes, indeed, very promising this process. And as Eric mentioned, yes, Plasmarica is working a lot to make this process commercial. Plasmarica, by the way, was the winner of our Global Technology Conference in Amsterdam when we had 2 years ago. So we are looking forward a lot to the development of this process, because we believe that it will have also quite a low carbon index. So very promising process. Are there any questions, Alejandro, in Spanish maybe that I do not know, I have not read?
Yes, Nikos, there is another one. And it says, you mentioned that DME can be produced from cow, I would say, excrement.
Yes.
It says, it says in my translator, cow dung.
That's right. Yeah, dung, excrement, manure, yes.
Okay. What is DME and how can this process be from cow dung?
Good question. Well, my experience with cow dung is, no, in all seriousness, cow dung emits a lot of methane. And what they do is on a lot of these large dairy farms, they bring it all together, and there's a lot of methane that is emitted out of these huge ponds or piles of dung or manure. And so what they can do instead is they take this stuff and they put it in a digester, right? And then they capture that methane. It's basically biogas. They start with biogas. And then they take that biogas and they convert that to dimethyl ether. And in fact, one of the main ways of making fossil DME is you take natural gas and convert it to DME. So this is basically just you go to renewable or biogas rather than fossil gas and turn that into DME. Now, one of the interesting things about DME is that it is quite similar in its properties to LPG. It's not exactly the same, but it's pretty similar. It's a liquid gas, so to speak. And one of the very interesting things about DME is when you burn it, it emits absolutely zero soot. So in cars, well, combustion engines, basically it has zero soot. So you can focus on eliminating the nitrous oxides and you get a much cleaner profile from combustion. So, and actually in the Far East, they already do blend DME into fossil LPG to some extent. It's typically blends of somewhere between 10 and 15% in some countries. So it's pretty interesting opportunity.
And as we mentioned before, exactly this DME, renewable DME, is a path that we are working on now as a complement to renewable LPG, this mixing with renewable DME. And this is a new work stream we have initiated a month ago.
Yes.
A month or so. Yeah. Any other questions, Alejandro, in Spanish in the chat?
Yes, there is one in Spanish, but I think that it will be very pertinent for the panel. So I will keep it for the panel. And there is one in English, and I think that we can attend that one, and then we move on to the next speaker.
Okay, maybe you're referring to the one that says if there are any data showing effects in engine durability by using renewable LPG as autogas?
Yes.
That's fine.
The one in English, we can deal with that, Eric, right now. And then the one in Spanish, I will take it for the panel. Okay.
Okay. What is the one in English then?
The one in English is: are there any data showing effects in engine durability by using our LPG as autogas?
All right. Well, the short answer is no. That there have not been any tests that I know of, and I don't think there have been any. But generally speaking, the HVO biopropane that is produced is actually more clean than some sources of fossil LPG, because as you probably know, sometimes in fossil LPG there's some sulfur in it, there's some mercury in it, there's various olefins and this and that, which sometimes mess up the profile, the emissions profile that comes out of it. By contrast, the stuff that is the biopropane, it is pretty much all biopropane. There's probably a bit of biobutane. There's probably a bit of, well, no, there's not going to be any bioethane. There's a bit of bionaphtha in it, but there's pretty much zero olefins and zero crud, if I may say, sulfur and mercury and phosphates and things like that. So probably it does better.
All right, Eric, so thank you very much indeed. And thank you also to those who put forward their questions. And I think this will bring us now to the next part. We all know, or most of us know, that California has been together with Europe at the very forefront of the environmental protection and also of renewables, including, of course, renewable LPG, renewable propane. So a lot of work has been happening in California. And with this, I would like to give the floor now to Joy Alafia, the president and CEO of the Western Propane Gas Association in the US, and give us her thoughts, her experiences. We know that the real world is not exactly, you know, as the theory. So Joy and Eva, I think, will take us through the real world and what's been happening in California and Europe, and now in California. So the floor is yours, Joy.
Thank you, Nikos, and very true. Buenos dias to everyone. And I am just delighted to be here and to share our journey to renewable propane. So, and you could go ahead to the next slide. So, you know, on the next slide, we'll see that there are your typical market drivers of supply and demand, but I'd make the case that there are some new market drivers that are in effect, and those are specifically the pressures from the public that influences the government action and also influences the action of industry and corporations. And Eric touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to just share a little bit more of what we're seeing here in California. On the next slide, let's talk about the public. And we see here that on that first little icon, 56% of Americans, and this is from a Pew Research study that was taken in 2018, 56% of Americans believe their family will be harmed by global warming. And 68% believe that fossil fuel companies should pay some sort of carbon tax. 69% are worried about global warming, and 75% of those surveyed think that global warming will affect the next generation, so they have concerns about that. And here in the US, you may know we have two dominant parties. We have the Democrats and the Republicans. And many people think that this is an issue that's associated with the Democratic Party, particularly when you look at the Biden administration and their push for a Green New Deal. But what this study found is that 78% of Republican millennials, that's the age group between 25 and 40, that population is also concerned about climate change. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about the government, there's kind of a variety of ways that we have seen action taken by the government, and that includes specifically targeting transportation that's known to have the highest emissions. We're now seeing a focus on building energy, similar to what we're seeing in Europe. And then we're also seeing specific applications even targeted, looking at perhaps burner tip applications. And I'd argue that we can innovate in a lot of those applications to address the concerns about emissions. So let's talk about emission trading on the next slide. Here in the US, we have a national program, which is the Renewable Fuel Standard. And in that program, you get RINs credits. This is why we see the majority of credits for renewable going specifically to transportation, and therefore the volume of renewable is going to the transportation market. There's the economic incentive to make that pencil out, if you will. Nationally, as I shared, there's a move towards a green economy and investment in infrastructure, particularly as we come out of this pandemic. We have a low carbon fuel standard here in California. Many states in the west of the US have this program as well, and Canada. And there's talk about making this a national program, as well as a national cap and trade program where you pay essentially for your emissions. On the next slide, we want to look at how these drivers are impacting corporations. And you know, one way is when you have a court order. So many of you probably heard about Royal Dutch Shell. They have a court mandate to slash their emissions by 45% by the year 2030, based on 2019 levels. When we look at other corporations on the next slide, you could see that, you know, that's a court-ordered operation, but aside from that, 90% of the Standard & Poor's 500, top 500 companies in the United States have some sort of sustainability statement or ESG commitment. So there's a recognition that for companies to be profitable, they need to invest sustainably and responsibly. What does that look like for British Petroleum? Well, they are saying they want net zero by 2050. And you can see a quote here from the then CEO, Bernard Looney, who shared that this is going to be a challenge, but we have to change and we want to change. It's the right thing to do for the world and the right thing to do for British Petroleum. When we look at Shell, they have set their sights on carbon neutrality by 2050. The shareholders just last April voted to produce less oil and cut carbon intensity by 20% by 2030 and to go carbon neutral by 2050. How are they going to do this? They're investing in electric vehicles, hydrogen, other renewables, and biofuels. Here we see ExxonMobil and their shareholder activism has taken effect with two recent appointment of board members. These board members were from kind of a minority group of investors, and they were kind of an upset to be appointed to the board, and their focus on environmental, social, and governance strategies as part of the business strategy. And I just want to point out that the two individuals were former executives from Marathon and Neste Oil. Both produce propane and renewable, the potential, at least for Marathon, for renewable, and Neste obviously is producing renewable propane. When we look at the next slide, this is the last shareholder activism I have, is looking at Chevron. They have taken at least a first step to look at Scope 3 emissions and to cut their Scope 3 emissions by 61%. So Scope 3 emissions deal with kind of upstream emissions, if you will. So looking at your solid waste, employee travel, how you purchase your electricity, your water treatment for your operations. They're going to focus on reducing those emissions. Next slide, please. And then Neste consistently ranks as one of the 100 most sustainable companies in the world from the Global 100 list. So let's take a look now, a deeper dive into biofuels, and I truly appreciate Eric's backdrop. I think he covered things very well as it relates to renewable propane. But there is also the recognition that all fuels, at least that you could argue are competitors, are also investing in renewable pathways. So the argument that propane is cleaner than gasoline, it's cleaner than diesel, well, that's today. But all of these fuels are innovating. And so we've seen an experiment in Seattle in 2019 to reduce petroleum by blending their gasoline with renewable isobutanol. And they're looking at a 50% blend potential. So all of these fuels are evolving. We have renewable diesel and biodiesel. We have renewable natural gas, and we will see, I predict, renewable gasoline. So it only makes sense as we look to the next slide that we invest in renewable propane. And so I like to share that there are some notable customers that already exist worldwide who are using renewable propane. Here in the United States, we're really pleased that U-Haul has made that investment in renewable propane for their van fleets that are used by the public. So the public has an opportunity to experience driving with renewable propane. Usually U-Haul consumers use it for moves, to move from one home to another. But school districts, government fleets, Coca-Cola, L'Oreal, you can see significant corporations are utilizing the fuel. Next slide. And so we have to innovate on all levels, and this is kind of the case for why renewable propane works, is because of the many benefits. The innovation on the engine side, the low NOx engines have pretty much made emissions comparable, particularly when you're running on renewable propane on life cycle emissions, to that of even electric vehicles. Renewable propane provides a pathway for ultra low, or when we blend with renewable DME, even a negative carbon footprint. Eric talked about it's pretty much the same molecule, so that fungibility makes that barrier of cost much lower than other renewable solutions. So this is an economic pathway, if you will, to decarbonization. Resiliency, I'm sure we all know how the portability of propane provides resiliency for communities all around the world. Here in California, renewable or propane in general, renewable or otherwise, is used in the pandemic to power temporary hospitals. It's used for wildfire base camps for firefighters when they're in the field to provide energy for them in the field. And of course, it could be used as complementary power, even for solar powered homes that still require more electricity. That could be generated with renewable electricity and renewable propane. And that renewable propane can also be used to net renewable electricity back to the grid. A lot of really creative ways to work in partnership with all renewables and to make sure that energy needs are met. Again, the economics work out because while there is a premium, it's not as significant as some of the other renewable solutions. And it's our way as an industry to be environmental stewards. So where does it come from? I think Eric covered that perfectly. So I'll just go ahead to the next slide of life cycle emissions. And this slide shows the carbon intensity, kind of a ratio, if you will, based on the low carbon fuel standard here in California. So Eric mentioned it really depends on how you calculate it. This is from the California Air Resources Board. And so the baseline fuel, the fuel that we're trying to reduce emissions compared to is gasoline and diesel. So you could see what their emissions profile looks like in terms of just that 100%. And when you get down to electricity in California, you're down to about 69% lower carbon intensity than that of gasoline. And that's because in California, we do get a significant portion of our electricity from renewable natural gas. And so renewable propane, again, the range could be as low as 5, but we have pathways that demonstrate as low as 19% versus the 100% of carbon footprint, if you will, associated with gasoline. So DME, I don't need to do too much there. I think Eric covered that well. But again, that negative 278, you could do some really creative things with blending with propane and that methane capture. I do want to mention that Dr. Ernest Moniz, who's a physicist who worked under the Obama administration, emphasized that we need to innovate on all fronts, not just the production of renewable solar and wind, but we also have to have carbon capture if we want to effectively address climate change. Next slide, please. So looking at carbon markets here, this slide shows some of the programs that we have that actually provide some sort of compensation. And this is based on our low carbon fuel standard from 2020. So the scale goes down every year or so, but you can see at least in 2020, we were still having a modest incentive, if you will, for fossil propane. And when you're displacing gasoline, a little less when you're displacing diesel. It gets into the energy efficiency. That's part of the calculation for these incentives in California. But for renewable propane, you could see you're looking at 82 cents per gallon for when you're displacing gasoline and 66 cents per gallon when you're displacing diesel. Federal credits, you're looking at 55 cents for renewable propane per gallon. And I have highlighted here AB 32, that's an assembly bill, but cap and trade, we should also be getting credits under cap and trade. And that's something that our association is working on. It's really more of a correction because renewable propane wasn't thought of, and we have to add us to the regulation. So when you look at the potential low carbon fuel standard credits with renewable DME and renewable propane, you're looking at $1.77 per gallon. And even with fossil propane and renewable DME, 88 cents per gallon. And this is with a blend of at about 20% renewable DME. So the purpose of these programs, and particularly in the low carbon fuel standard, is to every year improve the carbon intensity, lower the carbon intensity, if you will, for these renewable options. And so when you're looking at here in the kind of beige to off-white, you could see that the value for when you're displacing gasoline goes down, but we're still generating credits all the way out to 2027. This is your forklift application. So we're able to generate credits in LCFS with fossil propane all the way out until 2027. When we're replacing diesel, displacing diesel, 2021 is where we started to be deficit generators. I'd like to point out that our industry advocated to be included in this program because we saw it as a pathway while we would have to pay short-term pains for our fossil production or fossil use. The upside was the hopeful incentive for the production of renewable propane. And you can see here when you're displacing gasoline, that's in the light blue color, you're looking at 60 cents per gallon all the way out to 2030 and around 44 cents per gallon all the way out to 2030 when you're displacing diesel, typically in your medium duty trucks. So let's talk about supply. That's really the challenge that we see. And people say, well, it's a chicken egg. I'd say we're kind of beyond the chicken and egg. There is demand out there, but we're kind of in this curve of commercialization. And we need to really ramp up that commercialization, the volumes there to meet the demand and make the economics work out. So how do we make the economics work out? Well, we have hope. If you look to the next slide, we look to Rotterdam, and the fact that they're producing 65,000 tons annually tells us that this is doable, that this is achievable. But we have to operate from a position of aspiration and not necessarily scarcity. So if you look at our trajectory, we start with our path from zero to commercialization. And you could see here in 2018, that was a big year for us where we saw commercial production of renewable propane, both in the US as well as higher volumes, much higher in Europe. And we also had the introduction of our low NOx engine, very important to innovate in the engine space as well. Continuing on our timeline, you can see that we have had some developments in terms of incentive programs. So again, that low carbon fuel standard, we had energy grants for renewable DME. We had U-Haul commit to purchasing the first 1 million gallons of renewable propane. And just last May, we had a law that passed, or that was introduced and passed for incentives for tax reductions for DME and propane blends. So that's kind of how we get there. If you look at the US production, we're still growing, but I'm pleased to say that the trend is going in the right direction. So on the next slide is really the potential that we have for renewable propane. And this is really where we are focused as an association. We have to find a way to reach out to all of these producers who are now currently producing renewable diesel or plan to near term through that HVO process that Eric mentioned, and getting them to net that 5 to 6 to 8% yield to renewable propane. And what that would yield for the US is 280 million gallons of renewable propane as early as 2024. And to put that in context, that's about half of the total propane consumed in the United States. So with our eye on that target, we have set forth a sustainability statement, and that is identified, if you look to our next slide here, of 100% renewable propane in California by 2030. And it's going to take all of us working together, from legislators, regulators, and industry pushing to make this change. But what that can offer is 2.26 million tons of CO2 reductions annually. That's the equivalent of taking approximately 537,000 cars off the road every year. And it's a very, it's a low-hanging fruit opportunity, I would say. If you want to learn more, I have the website on the screen for where we publish our sustainability statement. We have also introduced legislation. So our Assembly Bill 1559 is specifically to incentivize the production of renewable propane for building energy use. In California, we've done a lot to decarbonize electricity, but what about those customers who aren't connected to the grid? There is a gap in equity and access, if you will, for those communities. And this bill seeks to provide renewable propane for those marginalized communities who don't have access to renewable electricity but they can have access through renewable propane. And you can see more information about this on our website. And we also have our own white paper with a lot of research from Eric Johnson as well on why renewable propane is so important and the promise that it gives for Californians. So the lessons I would share with you that we have learned is first, push for innovations. We have to keep advancing not just with the fuel, but also low burner tip technology, improving that, also our engine deployment. So, and even hybrid solutions. Demonstrate that we are part of the environmental solution. Show how we work together with other renewable options. Advocate at every level. Make sure you incentivize funding. Work with regulators, understanding their forecasts and how renewable propane can help them achieve their carbon reduction forecasts. And make sure you get fair treatment for the renewable propane. Sometimes they may want to tip the scales one way or the other, but all renewable fuels have an important role to play. Look at coalition partnerships. Look at those communities that are concerned about cost and renewable energy, and make sure that they aren't overly saddled with this burden. They are great partners to help advocate for themselves about why energy diversity is important. Look to other biofuels and business chambers as well. So I'll leave it there. I look forward to answering your questions either at the end of the session or if there are any questions now.
Yeah, that's great, Joy. Many, many thanks indeed. Very exciting, the journey you have gone through in California, and really your ambitions and your commitment to go the renewable path, really absolutely fantastic. There are questions in the panel, but maybe it would be best if we leave these for the panel when we are all together to answer them, because I think they may cover also things that Eva will be talking to us about. And I would prefer then to maybe go to the next part of Eva. And we know that the other very ambitious environment, it is Europe, which goes hand in hand with what we heard in California. A lot of things are happening, and very fast towards decarbonization, defossilization, a zero carbon future. And with this one, I would like to invite Eva. Eva Abramyuk, that you know, she's the general manager of the European LPG Association, Liquid Gas Europe. And with this, I would like to give the floor to Eva. Eva, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Nikos, and good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be today to discuss the BioLPG and how the process went in Europe. If we go to next slide, just a quick introductions. And next slide is quick introductions about Liquid Gas Europe. We represented the LPG suppliers, distributors, and equipment manufacturers. Our mission is to identify, monitor European energy environmental policy, engaging in ongoing dialogues, developing regulations, and promoting and raising awareness about LPG, and in this case about BioLPG. Hence, I'm really excited to be here today to talk about this. If we go to the next slide. So before going into a BioLPG discussion, just a quick update about the state of the market, the state of the BioLPG market. Today, BioLPG consumption in Europe is around 38.7 million tons, and it's so a marginal growth since 2018. The biggest demand comes from the biggest rise in demand comes from the petrochemicals and transport sector. Just to put it in perspective, the numbers represents around 20 million of EU citizens supplying in LPG, and 700,000 businesses. So the energy sector is still that dominates the demand picture in Europe, with consumption coming from domestic, industrial, agricultural, transport sectors, and they are amounting to around 22.4 million tons a year, and around 60% of regional total demand. If we go then to the next slide, To describe LPG, we have a very short video coming up, but BioLPG fits very well in the whole process and the whole picture of where Europe is going. And Nikos already mentioned that we are faced with a lot of very, very challenging legislative requirements. And this is a very short introduction to BioLPG in Europe.
Climate neutrality by 2050 is Europe's greatest vision. But how do we make it a reality? To be effective, the green transition must leave no one behind. And all future-proof technologies and energy solutions must play a part. How can the European LPG industry play a significant role in meeting Europe's greatest challenge? The answer is BioLPG. Learn more about how this renewable and versatile fuel can reduce emissions. When powering homes, transport, industry, and so much more. Together with Atlantic Consulting, Liquid Gas Europe developed a study on how BioLPG can support the pathway towards decarbonisation. And now we want to show you how the European LPG industry can be 100% renewable in 2050. Climate neutrality by 2050.
Thank you very much. Go to the next slide. So what is BioLPG? I think my colleagues have already described it quite well, but what is important here to know, BioLPG, it's exactly the same molecule as traditional LPG. The difference here is obviously the feedstock, where it comes from, and the production pathway. The biggest difference is also in CO2 emissions, and we see that the footprint of BioLPG can be 80% lower in comparison to conventional LPG. But it isn't in the identical molecule. So what it means is it can be used in the same applications for your cooking, for transport, for heating. But it's also what is also important is a drop in fuel, and it's currently, when it's sold, is used on a mass balance approach. So normally it's mixed with the traditional LPG and then distributed to consumers based on mass balance. If we then go to the next slide, I think the production pathway have been very well described by my colleague Eric before. But what is important to know here is that today only one production process in Europe is commercialized, and I think we saw a question before on that as well. The production pathway is the one of hydrotreated vegetable oil, so the HVO diesel. But there's also its variation, which is hydroprocessed ethers and fatty acids, HEFTA, which results in sustainable aviation. And today, the HVO HEFTA capacity are not enough to supply the BioLPG volumes for the 2050, and I will talk a little bit about it in a second. If we go to the next slide, then. Talking about the demand, I think it's very important to understand where your market is going, and in Europe, it's particularly interesting situation. We will see obviously a decrease in just generally energy consumption, and what we will see is probably that the consumption will fall by 1/10 by 2050. At the same time, in Europe, we see a rise in electrification. Especially this electrification will replace liquid fuels in transport, but also in space heating and cooling. Gaseous fuels, we see that the consumption will go down, but it will not be as sharp as with regards to the liquid fuels. And also we'll see that the solid fuels will mostly disappear in Europe. If we go to the next slide. What is important here to understand is that our industry is committed to reaching the 2050 by having 100% renewable bio-LPG in place. What we see that the future demand in 2050 will be around 8 to 12 million tons of LPG, and it will be almost entirely met by bio-LPG. Nearly 9 million tons will come from biorefining, pyrolysis, gasification, and power-to-X, and another 3.5 million tons will come from conversion of biogas. If one of the above pathways will not succeed, there are also alternative pathways that can replace it, and we already heard a little bit about them from my colleagues. If we go to the next slide, the EU policy landscape is one that is actually really shaping our current situation and where the LPG sector is heading to. And also have a very big impact on the bio-LPG and why it's developed here. We all probably heard about what the Commission plans are with regards to the Green Deal. The Green Deal aims to transfer Europe into a modern, resource-efficient and competitive economy. And the European Union is aiming to boost efficient use of resources by moving to clean and circular economy, by restoring biodiversity, and also by cutting emissions. What we will see in Europe here, and probably you can relate to that also in your country, is that we will see a lot of investments going into environmentally friendly technologies. There will be a lot of support for the industry to innovate, also to roll out cleaner, cheaper and healthier forms of private and public transport, and also to decarbonize the energy sector as such. We will see a publication in a couple of days of legislative packages, which will be aiming to also ensuring that the buildings are more efficient. And finally, the EU is working with partners globally to improve those global environmental standards. So we will see in a couple of days publication of new targets for 2030, which will have a very big impact on also on production and on development of bio-LPG. If we go to the next slide, just to reiterate that the EU is aiming to be carbon neutral in 2050, and the bio-LPG will play a very important role in meeting those objectives. If we go further, so what needs to be done from policy-making perspective? First of all, obviously bio-LPG must be recognized within the European policy frameworks and regulations. We do see that there is still a lot to be done with this regard. Bio-LPG is a relatively new product. It's available on the market for just a couple of years. And there is not necessarily awareness about the product, both among the policymakers, but also among the producers. But what is working well for other renewable energies, and what we are suggesting as well for moving ahead with bio-LPG, is to ensure that there are sufficient incentives in place both for consumers and also for producers, in order to ensure that that bio-LPG is further produced, and also the new production pathways are developed. If we move to the next slide. So what's the vision for the industry? I think when we look at the next 10 years, obviously we will see a lot of production of bio-LPG coming from biorefining and gasification. In the long term, I think it's worth observing what's going to happen with biogas to bio-LPG and power to X. And if we move to the next slide, I think what is still a lot of work to be done is to further grow the bio-LPG market. The policymakers' action is not sufficient, and it's the industry ambition to continue both bio-LPG and production by advising consumers and businesses on the possibilities of switching to LPG, by educating stakeholders, by approaching investors, but also considering investing in production of bio-LPG. We also will be looking into joining consortia but also sponsoring industry-funded projects and all other research needed. So if you see that any interest in one of those areas, I think I will be very happy to discuss it moving forward. If we move to the next slide, just to finish, we will have a more in-depth discussion about BioLPG at our upcoming e-Congress. It is a 3-day long Congress. We have a dedicated session to BioLPG. However, looking at the agenda today, it will be part of almost every single discussion, just to show how important topic that is for the European industry. So if you like to continue this discussion and learn more on the European level, we very much invite you to join this conference. And moving forward, just to give the floor back to Nikos, I would be happy also to answer any questions during the upcoming roundtable discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Eva. Great overview again from Europe, as we heard also from California and from Joel. I mean, these are the two regions that are most ahead in the renewables and BioLPG, renewable LPG. So I hope everybody has heard a lot and understood a bit more now about the renewables world, the renewable LPG, and this has opened everybody's appetite really to go this direction, and why. There are questions, I'm sure, with all of you. Some of them we have seen in the chat box, in the question box, and we have answered them. Some other ones we have left for the panel session, but maybe now it is the right moment that we move exactly to the panel session, and I would invite again Alejandro to take the seat, to take the floor, and lead us through the panel session discussion. So the floor is yours, Alejandro.
Thank you, Nico. It has been really interesting. All the explanations, all the information, all the analysis, it has been quite interesting. I think that we're going to have like 20 minutes, and I would like to leave like 10 minutes for Q&As from the audience, from the attendees, okay? So we'll have like 10 minutes for the panel, so I will just keep it brief. By the way, I will assume a devil's advocate role. It is very easy for me because I'm already a lawyer. I think that we can talk about two main areas of interest in the panel. One of them is the efficacy, the effectiveness of BioLPG to address the global environmental commitment challenges that humankind is facing right now. And the second one is the economic viability of our LPG. By the way, we can start with a question that we asked you yesterday. What is the difference between our LPG and BioLPG? I think that will be very interesting because we use BioLPG. Perhaps someone of you could, during the panel, explain the difference. Let's start with the first topic, the usefulness, efficacy, advantages, the relevance of our LPG in the face of global environmental challenges. The first question, I think, Eric said, and perhaps we can start with Eric. Let's keep it like a dialogue. So please feel free to intervene, and we can have like a chat with an audience. Eric, you said that our LPG has a worse carbon footprint than our LPG. Than fossil LPG. Is it right? I mean, what is the goal? Is to be renewable or to decarbonize energy generation?
Very much to decarbonize. And this is an ongoing issue, but it's very much to decarbonize, because in some cases, going renewable can be higher carbon than going fossil. And I think it took governments a while. I mean, this has really been a big issue since about 2005. And initially, I think it was all about renewable, and then people kind of figured out that some renewables are not so good. And so, no, it's very much about decarbonization, because it's all about the climate change and preventing large temperature rises.
But if bioLPG has a worst carbon footprint, the RLPG has, I mean, worst carbon footprint, why are we going to change from fossil LPG?
Oh, no, it's not.
I don't know that it's the worst. I think it's actually, in some cases it can be bad, but generally speaking, the stuff that is on the market today is somewhere between 50 and 80% lower carbon than fossil LPG. That would be the general rule. So it is better. It is definitely better.
It is better.
Yes, no question. Yeah.
If I could, I'll just add one thing also to that. Here in California, and Eric spoke to it, it really depends on how you're calculating it. But one thing that's really great about California's low carbon fuel standard program is it looks at life cycle emissions of all of the fuels. So it's a very holistic approach from, start to finish of looking at the total carbon footprint. And when you look at energy consumption that way, taking it into its total, you can find that depending on the feedstock, you can actually have a propane vehicle that has a lower carbon footprint, again, on a life cycle analysis, than even that of electric vehicles, again, depending on how you're generating your electricity. So I think Eric is spot on that you do want to look at decarbonization as a goal and truly assess what is the total carbon footprint, because it does us no good to have zero emissions in one small area, but then huge emissions in another part of the world. So we need to all work together in lowering our carbon footprint.
Yes, but the people say that biofuels are competing with food production.
All right.
How do you tackle that? How do you address that?
It is a difficult issue to address. But if you start looking at what biofuels consume opposed to food production, it's maybe like 2%, 3%. I mean, it's really quite small. And the other thing is that, if you have to look at the entire agricultural production system. And basically, my assessment is that it's a chimera. It's a non-issue, really. I mean, if you try to look at it scientifically. At the same time, I recognize politically, it comes up all the time. People, they hold protests and all these kind of things. And so you cannot ignore it. And sometimes trying to give scientific answers to political issues does not work. I realize that. But at the same time, if we start from a factual basis, it's just not a serious issue, really.
Okay. Could it be said that the fossil LPG is for the transition and the bioLPG is the goal?
Yeah, I very well said. To me, yes.
Yeah, it seems that the time framework, the commitments, both in Europe and in California, are very optimistic.
Yes.
Yes, it seems.
Well, I tried to say that, the thing is, when you look at the net zero scenario that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, has produced, it's extraordinary. We get rid of fossil boilers in 5 years. We get rid of internal combustion cars in 15 years. Well, at least sales of them in 15 years. I don't know. Sometimes they're a big change. I mean, what's amazing, if you look at the electricity industry, they have gone from a position where photovoltaics and wind power were just, kind of crazy ideas and very expensive. And now wind and photovoltaic are the cheapest forms of new electricity capacity. Things can change radically.
I'll just add, in California, what I've seen, at least in terms of regulatory agencies, is we are very ambitious, and I think our association is now kind of in that same box. And we strive for really big accomplishments and goals. And I have seen instances where at least the California Air Resources Board, our air agency here, may have missed the mark, but where they fall short, they still have made tremendous strides. And so I think that is also something that at least I've experienced in California over the past few years.
But it seems that the competitivity of our LPG depends on subsidies.
Yes, it does. Yeah, I would say it does, yes.
Yes, and it looks viable in the developed world. I'm not sure in the developing world, but again, looking to the actual, not post, but COVID economy, do you think that those projections in the timeline will suffer?
Well, one thing I would just quickly say is that in the developing world, there tend to be large subsidies for fossil fuels. In Colombia, for instance, there are. I mean, probably the biggest example is Iran and Saudi Arabia. They subsidize fossil fuels massively. So what I guess my message to governments would be, hey, why don't you take that money and put it towards towards renewable, domestic production? You're putting it into your own country rather than giving it to an importer. Hey, I think that's win-win.
Okay.
It's just generally on the subsidies, indeed, but looking at the general, how generally the LPG industry is working today, and as we see, there are different types of subsidies or help, let's say, from the government, like tax incentives, etc. So there can be different types of incentives that can be offered to help both for the consumers and for the producers. And I think we have quite a lot of experiences in Europe with very variety of lists of those. Subsidies indeed subsidies go today both into the fossil fuels also in Europe, and I think we see a lot in the gas industry, and so all industry is still there, but also there are different types of incentives in transport area, especially where you see different taxation on diesel, petrol, and LPG, and that also is helpful for development of the sector. So I think when a policymaker looks at from this perspective, they have a variety of choices to have.
Eva, maybe a response also is related to what you said on the question that we had received. Why renewable LPG is only economically viable for the transportation sector and not for the residential sector, right?
Indeed, and I think that answer indeed this question. We see a lot of incentives that goes into the transport sector today in Europe, but it's not the same in the heating and residential sector. There are different taxation applied to both fuels in different markets, so it's very complicated. It is not unified. So this is something that the upcoming legislation is going to do also on the renewable side, just going to unify all the different types of incentives, taxations in Europe. So yeah, it's very interesting. But I think Eric wants to add something to this.
Well, I want to ask a question. I'm very much to what you just said, Eva. Is that Joy talked about this? What AB 1559? I mean, I think this is fantastic. Can you tell us more about that, Joy?
Yeah, sure. So let's face it, all renewable energy sources need incentives. We are not alone in that way. I think where we struggle is people don't necessarily think, at least here in California, they don't immediately think about propane. So transportation is the first market that we sought to decarbonize as a state. And so we saw investments there. The focus is now on building energy, and there is effort underway for the utilities to decarbonize. And they have mandates to produce renewable electricity from renewable natural gas. But no one thought about propane. And so that is why a bill such as what we introduced provides the financial incentive for producers to produce renewable propane specifically for building use. You know, I look at it, it's really no different than incentives for people to install solar on their home. Yeah. We need kind of a similar type of program for renewable propane.
Very interesting.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes left. So I'm going for the last question, and then we open for Q&A to the audience. And I think this is for everybody in the panel. What do you think companies have to do in your experience? How difficult is the LPG producing, distributing, and trading companies that are currently in the market to allow our LPG to enter into the market? And this was a question from someone in the audience. I mean, what do the companies have to do in the market to allow renewable LPG to enter into the market? What are the first steps?
I'll jump in. I don't know if I'm going to nail this answer. It's tough. It is really tough. There's a saying, kind of the tail wagging the dog. Where if you're not the producer, then we have to, I think, in coalition with the association and various companies, work with those producers to make the moral case and the financial case of why producing renewable propane is important. And frankly, it's something that we struggle with. We're looking at how do we demonstrate to producers that the demand is there. And I can tell you the first movers in California who are distributing renewable propane, they've made this part of their marketing strategy. So this could be seen as part of their investment in marketing to demonstrate their commitment to sustainability. And they're getting a lot of, rightfully so, PR out of it for the good work that they're doing. But I think you have to demonstrate the need for it, and that you can help get the fuel from the producer to the customer. That's the other kind of challenge that they were able to overcome. They were able to demonstrate we can actually get this fuel to the market where it pencils out.
I'd say, Alejandro, you are the key person, really, because you know no, seriously, I mean it, that you know the government, you know the industry, you know the LPG people, and that by you communicating with all of those, I think you could make it happen.
Yes, because we have the challenge as a country, and to move forward a renewable energy economy. So yes, we must address this, and as a matter of fact, we are advancing and we are coming to that, but it's not easy. It's not easy because our economy right now with COVID and everything, and even before that, I mean, it's quite expensive. But I think that we have like 6 minutes. So I'm afraid we must, no, perhaps there are questions from the audience. Herman? No, it seems that there are not questions. Do you, Nikos, anything, or I move to the conclusions and final remarks?
Well, myself, I would like to ask Joy and Eva, with their experience, for a country like Colombia, who jumps into the subject now, what would be the first key and most important things to do first and to do right?
Yes, thank you, Nikos. It's not an easy question, is it? At the very end of our
You
conversation.
comment for joy, yeah.
But I think it's just to reiterate what I've said. It's first of all, I agree with Joy. That is, you not necessarily think about propane when you think about gas, or about heating, or about transport. So there is a lot of education that needs to be done, both towards consumers, but also the businesses, and what kind of benefits the bio-LPG and bio-LPG brings in the future as well, to make sure that we educate both all the types of stakeholders, from the refiners to policymakers. There's a lot of conversation that needs to be done at the level in Colombia, to make sure that that people and businesses understand this potential. Approaching investors on possible projects to produce the bio-LPG, but also joining different types of consortia, and probably in Europe we'll see more of this happening. So if there are any types of projects that we can develop commonly with Colombia, I would be very happy to look at this. Also with the European funding, as we know that there is some funding available for projects like that. So there is a lot of upfront work to be done. There is not one goal or one solution to this. I think it's a multi-layer approach, and it's a lot about to wait. Where the investment needs to be made in Colombia as well. As you said, we are faced with a difficult situation, but in Europe, because we are faced in the difficult situation with COVID, and the economic crisis that also is approaching Europe very fast, our authorities said we are going to use this as an opportunity to invest into clean technologies. And that's why this opens an opportunity also for bio-LPG.
Joy?
I'm going to say well said. I think Eva covered very well anything that I could have thought of. I will add perhaps that you in Colombia are in a great position, and that you are kind of ahead of the curve, right? I envy you because you could lay the groundwork now that will reap dividends in a way that we are now in a position of almost having to advocate and almost fight for the role of biofuels. But certainly I think where you are, you can be integrated from the inception in decarbonization plans. So take advantage of that. I'd also just share, take the lessons learned from the pandemic. We've demonstrated why it's a failed strategy to rely solely on one energy source. We've seen that here in California with, again, temporary hospitals being powered by propane, testing facilities being powered with propane. So making these cases of energy security, resiliency, and clean energy equity, those are kind of the pillars I would use for your foundation.
Excellent, thank you. So Alejandro.
I think Nico, that the panel is over because we don't have more time. Thank you very much for all of our panelists and speakers. It has been very interesting. And perhaps, Nico, shall I move to the final remarks and conclusions?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. So I would say that, first of all, bio-LPG has a low carbon footprint, up to 80% less than fossil LPG, I understood. Second, bio-LPG is always a byproduct. I would like to say co-product. It's a co-product of other biofuels. Bio-LPG requires incentives, subsidies to be viable. And then I would say that new technologies with other biofuels lead to competition with the bio-LPG. They can be better. in Europe, the LPG market is mainly supported by petrochemicals. This is a big difference with the Colombian market. It poses a challenge for us. The main oil companies in the world have in their mission and vision to turn towards biofuels, and that's good news. And finally, a final remark from Joy was very interesting. And for us in the LPG industry, it became very notorious, is that COVID has shown the world that there is a need to not depend in only one source of energy. And the LPG and bio-LPG are the answer because the mobility and the characteristics of LPG and bio-LPG. With that, I think that we can finish. We are going to have the session, the recording, the video in our website, in GasNovas, and as well in the World LPG Association and the Californian and the Liquid Gas Europe associations. We are going to have the recording in those webs, so you can find the recordings and the presentations for further reference information and analysis. So thank you very much. Thank you, Nikos. It has been very interesting. I enjoy a lot working with you, Eva, Joy, Eric. Thank you for being here. And I would like to remember all of our audience that the WLPGA is going to host their Congress in Dubai this year by December, isn't it, Nikos?
Yes, in December, exactly, beginning of December.
Yes, and GasNova is going to have it on November. So you will be able to attend the GasNova's Congress. By the way, it's virtual this year. And I will leave you, and thank you everybody for being here today. I will leave you with a promotional video of our Congress. Thank you very much for attending the webinar.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Sergio, next slide. Sergio, it's not working. So thank you very much to